In November 1964, a New York judge convicted Lenny Bruce of obscenity following performances at Café Au Go-Go in Greenwich Village. The sentence was 4 months in a workhouse. Bruce appealed. The appeal consumed the last 2 years of his life. He died in August 1966, with the conviction still on his record, the appeal still pending, and the legal machinery that had destroyed his career still in motion. In December 2003, 37 years later, New York Governor George Pataki granted Lenny Bruce a posthumous pardon, the first in New York State history. George Carlin was one of the people who had worked toward that moment. He had been working toward it for decades. The satisfaction of that morning was, by every account, complicated. Carlin had known Bruce, not as a close friend. They were not of the same generation in a way that made intimacy natural, but as someone whose work he had followed closely and whose fate he had watched with the specific attentiveness of a person who understood that what was happening to Bruce was a demonstration of something important. He had been at the funeral in 1966. He had carried what he saw there into the transformation years that followed. And he had, across the intervening decades, spoken and written and advocated for the recognition that the conviction had been wrong. The advocacy was not the most visible part of his public work. Carlin was not primarily a political activist in the organized sense. He distrusted organized responses to problems that he believed required individual thinking, and he had said so many times and at considerable length on stage. But the Bruce case was specific. It was a documented injustice with a clear history and a clear remedy. A man had been convicted for speech. The conviction had contributed to his death. The record of that conviction was still official. The remedy was to correct the record. He was not alone in the advocacy. The case for a posthumous pardon had been building for years before it reached Pataki's desk, driven by legal scholars, First Amendment advocates, and a range of people in the entertainment industry who understood the significance of what had happened to Bruce and what it continued to represent. Carlin was part of that coalition, not its leader, not its most visible spokesperson, but a consistent presence in the argument for why the pardon was necessary and what it would mean. The argument he made, when he made it, was characteristically precise. It was not an argument about Bruce being a saint or his material being beyond criticism or the performances that had prompted the arrest being the finest work in American comedy. It was an argument about what a criminal conviction for speech meant, about what it said about the legal system and about the culture that had operated it, and about the specific damage it had done to a specific man who had died with it unresolved. Pataki signed the pardon in December 2003. Bruce had been dead for 37 years. The conviction that had helped kill him was officially expunged from the record. It was, in the narrow legal sense, a correct outcome. In a wider sense, it was an acknowledgement, official, public, signed by the executive authority of the state that had prosecuted him, that the New York obscenity trial of 1964 had been wrong, that the speech it had prosecuted was protected speech, that the comedian who had refused to stop saying what he thought had been right, and that the institutions that had moved to silence him had been wrong, and that this was now the official version. Carlin's response to the pardon was characteristically measured. He expressed satisfaction. He noted that it had taken 37 years. He observed, with the precision that characterized everything he said, that a posthumous pardon was a correction that arrived too late to benefit the person it was supposed to vindicate. That Bruce had needed the pardon in 1964 and 1,965 and 1,966 when the conviction was consuming his ability to work and his will to continue, and that receiving it in 2003 was not the same thing as having received it then. This was not a dismissal of the pardon. It was an honest assessment of what the pardon was, a correct act that carried within it the implicit acknowledgement of the long period during which the correct act had not been taken. The satisfaction and the grief were both present in that assessment, and he did not try to separate them. He had been 27 years old when the trial happened. He had been 29 when Bruce died. He was 66 when the pardon came. The span of the advocacy was essentially the span of his mature career. The issue had been present in his professional life for as long as the career that the Bruce years had helped shape. There is a specific quality to advocating for something over 37 years. It requires a kind of patience that is different from optimism. The patience of someone who believes something is correct and continues to act on that belief without requiring the outcome to arrive on any particular schedule. Carlin had that patience for this specific thing in a way that his general philosophy, skeptical of institutions, resistant to organized action, doubtful about the prospects for collective improvement, might not have predicted. The distinction, perhaps, was that this was not about improving the system. It was about correcting a specific, documented wrong. That was something he could commit to without requiring faith in the institutions that would eventually correct it. The pardon was not evidence that the system worked. It was evidence that specific pressure applied over specific time produced specific results. He understood the difference. He talked about Bruce less frequently in the years after the pardon, not because the subject had ceased to matter, but because the active work of the advocacy was done. The record had been corrected. The argument had been won. There was less to say that had not been said. He died 5 years after the pardon, in June 2008. The work he had done to clear Bruce's name was a small part of the public record of his career, less visible than the HBO specials and the Supreme Court case and the transformation of the early 1970 seconds. It was also, in its own way, among the most direct expressions of who he was. The willingness to apply consistent effort over a long period to a specific correct outcome, regardless of whether that effort was particularly visible or particularly rewarded. Lenny Bruce was convicted in 1964. George Carlin spent 37 years working toward the correction of that conviction. The correction came in 2003. It was too late for Bruce. It was not nothing. Carlin knew the difference between those two things. He always knew the difference.